Gloucester, Massachusetts is America's oldest seaport. For most of its 400-year history, Gloucester was the fishing capital of the world. Its lifeblood is dangerous and costly. More than 10,000 people have left this port and lost their lives in the Atlantic. When disaster strikes, few live to tell the tale. But one fisherman's story of survival at sea surpasses all others, and his ambition and daring made him a legend in Gloucester and one of the most celebrated seafarers in history. I'm Corey Kukuru for 1623 Studios, and this is the story of Howard Blackburn. Howard Blackburn was born on February 17, 1859, in a small cottage in Port Medway, a booming lumber town on the southern coast of Nova Scotia. The Blackburns were a fishing family, and Howard's fascination with the sea was instilled at a young age. His rough-and-tumble father and grandfather both earned a living on the water. Howard spent his formative years swimming, sailing, and rowing the Medway River with his 7 siblings. He was exceptionally strong and independent for a child obsessed with becoming a man. It was obvious to the Blackburns that young Howard was going to forge his own path, whether they liked it or not. At age 10, he skipped school constantly to work at a sawmill. Howard's parents punished him over and over, but relented and let him live with a tradesman so he could earn $6 a month building cabinets. But woodworking bored Howard, so he fled the sawmill when he was 11, walked over 20 miles to the town of Bridgewater, and became a lumberjack. Before he was a teenager, Howard toiled with rugged outdoorsmen in an unforgiving part of the world. He developed a man's build. While on the job, he saw a depiction of Columbus landing in the West Indies, which further inspired him to sail the world. Further, because the Blackburns already boasted one world traveler, though Grandfather John's adventure was quite unintentional. A few winters before Howard's birth, John Blackburn and 2 crewmen planned a routine sail on his Pinky boat 80 miles northeast of Halifax to exchange goods for booze. They brought no navigational equipment. Hours after departure, a violent nor'easter blew them off course, setting them adrift for days. They maintained composure and followed the wind, pleasantly surprised with the unseasonably warm February weather. 42 days later, they landed just south of Halifax, 2,000 miles south, in St. Martin. They returned to Port Medway nearly a year later, astonishing family and friends who thought they were dead. Howard's life at sea got off to an equally inauspicious start. He and a young friend were fishing off Pudding Pan Island when their boat flipped. Howard swam for an hour before a fishing crew pulled him aboard. The incident didn't shake his faith, nor did the deaths of his father Bill, who capsized and drowned in the Medway River, and his older brother Will, who was lost at sea. Instead of spooking Blackburn, Howard became more adamant about becoming a sailor. The captain who found Blackburn treading water gave him his first job as a fisherman. Barely a teenager, Howard began sailing on American and English vessels from pole to pole, learning the seafarer's lifestyle and, more importantly, the behavior of the global waterways. Now 20 years old, Blackburn was burly, worldly, and could handle his rum. But deep down, Howard believed the biggest test of manhood was to go schooner fishing in the treacherous banks of the North Atlantic. In his eyes, there was only one place in the world where that could happen. In April of 1879, Howard Blackburn arrived in Gloucester. For 3 years, he earned a solid reputation amongst the Gloucester fleet, fishing nonstop until Christmas, when he'd return to Port Medway to visit family. It was during a break in January 1883 that Blackburn learned of a last-second opening on the Grace L. Fears, an 80-foot schooner known as the Queen of the ultra-competitive halibut fleet. The Fears made top money and hired the best crew. It was a golden opportunity. On January 21, 1883, the Fears left Nova Scotia for the 400-mile trek northeast to the churning Burgeo Bank off Newfoundland in a mad rush to be first to market. On the 3rd day, the Fears set anchor. The crew broke off into pairs and manned 6 dory boats to set trawl lines. The dories were 18 feet long, flat-bottomed and open. Nothing more than simple rowboats. Blackburn was 23 years old, 6'2" and over 200 pounds. The only newcomer on the crew, he was paired with Tom Welch of Newfoundland. Welch was younger and lighter than Blackburn, but had experience on the Fears. That morning, the two set a half-mile of trawl line, then returned to the schooner for mug-up. The seas and sky were calm, but the captain sensed an impending storm and ordered the crew to retrieve the trawl lines just 2 hours after setting them. Passing on the potential haul was costly, but not worth the risk. As Blackburn and Welch rowed past the other dories to collect their line, a quiet snow began to fall. The wind blew from the southeast, a good sign. They rowed on. Suddenly, the air became quiet. As the other dories headed back, a different wind arose, this time from the northwest, and soon it turned fierce. In an instant, Blackburn and Welch were caught in a squall. They rowed furiously but lost their bearings. The other dories seemingly vanished. Hours passed. Thinking they rowed past the Fears, they dropped anchor. By nightfall, the snow lessened. The Fears raised a signal torch to guide the lost crewmen. Now and then, the undulating ocean cruelly bobbed the dory just high enough so that Blackburn and Welch could catch a glimpse of the Fears, but it was too far away. All night, Blackburn and Welch took turns bailing and rowing, but the wind and surf were so vicious that with each stroke, the two actually lost progress. Gear on the dory began to freeze, forcing Blackburn and Welch to dump any excess weight overboard, including tubs of trawl lines. They had no fresh water or food except the fish they caught, and that ice solid. The Fears was well out of sight by then. To keep from drifting further, Blackburn and Welch dropped anchor again. For hours they bailed. When Howard removed his mittens to better handle the bucket, Welch accidentally bailed them away. It was then that Tom Welch noticed that Howard's hands were gray and crystallizing. Blackburn tried putting his socks on his hands, but they too froze and were lost. The only way he could be useful, he thought, was if he bent his fingers around the oars to freeze in place. To curve his fingers in position, he smashed his hands repeatedly on ice in the boat that had begun to weigh the vessel down. Then he gripped the oars. Welch was horrified. Even worse, he was discouraged. Late into their second day adrift, Blackburn noticed that his dory mate had stopped bailing. Howard barked at his partner to startle him, but Tom's expression was blank. "I'm blind," said Welch. "There's no use. We can't last another night." Blackburn broke his hands from the oars, laid Welch down, and started bailing. Welch, crazy from thirst, tried jumping out. Howard pulled him back and fed him ice, but all Welch could do was mumble prayers. The surf was relentless. Howard rowed towards what he hoped was the coast of Newfoundland, but there were no signs of land. Welch was catatonic. Occasionally, he blurted Blackburn's name. When Howard turned to bail again, Welch was dead. Frostbite swelled Howard's hands so badly that he couldn't put Welch's mittens over them. Instead, he put his hands between his legs, crouched down to avoid the gales, and rocked back and forth to stay awake through the night. He watched helplessly as Welch's oars spilled overboard. On the third day adrift, sunrise oversaw a calm sea. The storm finally passed. Blackburn and his gear were encased in ice, which burdened the dory. He was wonderstruck to see that his anchor lines had frayed to threads, yet froze solid, keeping the vessel from tipping overnight. He repaired what he could and continued rowing. By noon, his finger flesh began breaking off like dry powder, the blood freezing instantly. He rowed on instinct alone, bone on wood. Far in the distance, Blackburn eyed a snow-covered rock. He spent the entire day and night rowing, bailing, and cowering just to stay alive. 4 days into an endless odyssey, Howard Blackburn approached land. The snow-covered rock he zeroed in on was an uninhabited island, but soon he found other clusters of rocks. Again, he rowed for the entirety of the day. By evening, a coastline appeared. There were no homes or harbor, but steep, snowy bluffs to follow. He fought a swift tide. Finally, there was a positive sign. Blackburn noticed 2 distinct colors of rushing water. He figured he was at the mouth of a harbor where fresh river water flowed into the sea. Adrenalized, he rowed until spotting a broken wharf and abandoned shed, a mere footprint of human existence, but inspiring nonetheless. As he looked for signs of life, a curious thing happened. He got desperately thirsty. Voices of former shipmates taunted him that he wouldn't make it. Delirious and defeated, Blackburn backtracked to the lifeless hut. When he finally reached shore, Blackburn stood up to drag the dory onto land but stumbled. His feet were frozen. He stomped through knee-high snow to the shed. The roof was gone, a table and bed covered in drifts. There was a half-barrel of salt cod, but he had enough sense to realize eating salt would kill him. So he chipped through the ice and laid fish in the snow, hoping to draw the salt out. It never occurred to Howard that some of the cod and halibut he and Welch caught 4 days earlier was still in the dory. Sitting in the dilapidated shed, Blackburn noticed the silhouette of a schooner on the black horizon. Now he knew there was a harbor close by. The plan was to spend the night in the hut, then row at dawn. He found some flint, but was incapable of starting a fire, so he balled up old fishing lines and nets to use as a pillow and blanket. Still exposed to the elements, Blackburn shivered uncontrollably. If he slept, he'd die, so he spent the night pacing and crawling on the floor eating snow. At dawn, Blackburn heard the dory thrashing against the flat rocks. It was fractured and flooded. Tom Welch's body had warped grotesquely. While repairing the boat, he heard a faint gunshot. Howard remembered that in the winter, successful fishermen often stayed in cabins at outposts with their families to hunt. He screamed for help, but his calls went unanswered. The thought of human contact brought another sudden rush of thirst that triggered a second bout of delirium. Convinced that the old wharf must have a freshwater well, Blackburn crazily waded and dived through waist-high snow, searching for low points in the drifts. There was no well. When Howard regained his senses, he went to shore to repair the dory. First, he had to drag Tom Welch off the boat. He used a gaff to pull the body close, but when he tried lifting Welch, Howard suffered an excruciating hernia. As he pushed the bulge of organs back into his body, he watched Welch sink to the bottom of a tidal pool. Blackburn yanked the dory away from the surf, biting down on the anchor line to hold the boat in place between crashing waves. He drained it, filled the keg with snow, took one last look at Tom Welch's floating body, and pushed off to row. Hugging the coast, he sloshed through one featureless cove to the next. Then, a glimmer of hope. 2 schooners on the horizon. Blackburn made an immediate beeline and got close enough to see a man on deck, but the wind shifted and pushed him away before getting spotted. It was devastating, but Howard kept on. The leak worsened and the sea got choppy. Snow started to fall. Blackburn turned all the way back to the hut to regain whatever strength he had left. That night, he rowed along the opposite side of the bank. Chunks of ice perilously floated by. There was fresh water somewhere. He was 1 mile beyond where he reached the day before when he noticed a cluster of cabins in the moonlight. Blackburn fought the current, zigzagging at a glacial pace. Every time he stopped to bail, he lost progress, but the battered dory finally reached a frozen inlet. A group of men crossing the ice stopped in their tracks, stunned beyond belief at the sight of a haggard, lone voyager willing his pitiful boat to land. They sensed the enormity and the emergency. After 5 days and nights of hell in the North Atlantic, without food, without hope, without the use of his hands or feeling in his feet, Howard Blackburn was about to be saved. But, as the shadowy figures on the ice slowly came into focus, Blackburn had no idea that his road to recovery had only just begun. Howard Blackburn's exhausted dory, listing badly and filled with water, limped to a stop upon the ice. Too proud to acknowledge his condition, Blackburn announced through gritted teeth that he would turn back to retrieve his dory mate. The stunned men pulled Howard ashore and bailed the vessel. 3 of the men pushed off to find Tom Welch. They asked Blackburn where to row. At the house down the river, he told them, in the tidal pool. The rescuers hadn't realized that Welch was dead. More people arrived at the water's edge. They were all members of the Lishman family and occupied a handful of shabby log cabins at Little River, now known as Grey River, a remote fishing settlement on the south coast of Newfoundland. It was instantly apparent that the Lishmans were terribly poor. A dozen children hopped on their bare feet to keep warm. They were joined by a pack of scrawny dogs. Those tending to Howard gave him a sense of place. The island Howard ignored because he thought it was uninhabited, Ramia, actually had a village on its opposite side. The first mainland he had spotted was Gulch Cove. If Howard hadn't chased the 2 schooners in open water in hopes of being sighted, he would have reached Cape Lahoon, a prosperous town with its own physician. Not exactly what Blackburn wanted to hear. Frank Lishman was the patriarch. He and his wife took Howard into their home. The floor was frozen dirt, the walls caked with mud, and a fireplace jutted through the roof. The family tub was a flour barrel. The beds were pallets of straw. Howard wondered if the situation he was in was better than what he just endured. Seeing the frostbite, the Lishmans cut away Howard's clothes and gave him tea with spruce boughs to drink, fearing water would kill him. They also offered hard bread. It was the first Howard had eaten in 114 hours. Mrs. Lishman soaked Howard's hands and feet in a saltwater brine, then bandaged him with flour paste and cod liver oil. The pain was agonizing. It was another sleepless night. The next morning, Mrs. Lishman changed the bandages, applying a powder of crushed mussel shells over the wounds. Howard's fingers, still curved from being frozen to the oars, started falling off. Gangrene set in. Each day, Mrs. Lishman cut off the blackened flesh while her daughter covered Howard's head with an apron to spare him the sight. They did this routine for weeks on end before new skin started to form. Howard lost all of his fingers, half of both thumbs, and 1 heel. Helpless for months, Blackburn sometimes went crazy and tried crawling on all 4s through the scrub brush to escape, only to be found and returned. Meanwhile, the desolate village of Little River was on the verge of starvation. The Lishmans survived on cod, flour, cornmeal, and melted snow. With the river frozen, the Newfoundland government in Burgeo was unable to send provisions. With supplies running out, the dogs were used for stew. Horrified, Howard choked down the broth and made sure the children ate the meat. A small group left Little River to beg the closest town for help, but all they brought back was bread damaged by kerosene. A reverend in Burgeo telegraphed the American consulate at St. John's, relaying the story of Howard Blackburn and the condition of the villagers nursing him to health. 6 months of provisions were sent, caravaned from one lonely outpost to the next before finally reaching Little River. It was the first time many of the Lishmans tasted real sugar or fresh milk. They consumed everything in days. News of Howard Blackburn's ordeal was chronicled around the world. A seal hunting steamer called the Nimrod was temporarily stuck in ice near Little River. The 30-man crew knew Howard's story and set out for the village to meet the seemingly mythical figure. When they saw the immobilized hero and the state of poverty in which the Lishmans lived, they left their lunches, returned to the steamer, and brought more provisions. It was the Lishman children who haunted Howard's mind. They couldn't read, so Blackburn did his best by reciting childhood stories or reading from the one book in the cabin, a ragged family Bible. Another month of monotony and pain passed. Spring arrived, and the ice began to break. The ground softened enough so Tom Welch could be buried in a simple grave in Burgeo. Howard was desperate to leave, even though he had no use of his hands or feet. It was April 22, 1883, when Blackburn insisted on going to Burgeo to begin the long process of returning to Gloucester. It had been 85 days since he landed at Little River. Despite their protestations, the Lishmans obliged. They carried Howard to a small dory so volunteers could row him away. He couldn't help but notice that of the 16 dogs who greeted him when he landed 3 months before, only one was left. As the Lishmans bid Howard farewell, Mrs. Lishman presented him with a small wooden box. Inside were all of his amputated fingers and toes. It was their tradition, she explained, that a person be buried with all of their body parts. Upon reaching Burgeo, Howard was taken to Tom Welch's grave. He left the wooden box with him. Blackburn stayed in a couple of homes for another month before a steamer took him 100 miles to St. Pierre, a small poor island off the Newfoundland coast controlled by the French. He started limping around without help. From there he took another steamer to Halifax and then to Boston, 133 days after the Grace L. Fears sailed to catch halibut. When Howard arrived at the train depot in Gloucester just before the start of summer, he was hailed a hero. Mobs of people cornered Howard wherever he went. The curious wanted to see him, and fishermen wanted to hear every detail. Blackburn was all too eager to share. He didn't have to pay for a drink or a meal anywhere. But Howard's disability brought him to a troubling crossroads. How could a fisherman survive without fingers or functioning feet? Yes, he was where he wanted to be, in the heart of the world's fishing industry. But how would he get by? The people of Gloucester stepped up. A candid interview with a local paper led to a campaign that raised $500 for Howard. He also got an $86 share from the Grace L. Fears, but only for the time he spent fishing before he disappeared. On October 16, 1883, Blackburn used the money to open a cigar and tobacco store on Main Street. On the same day, he became a naturalized citizen. Blackburn's shop featured 3 illustrations and a booklet of his ill-fated trip. Copies were available for purchase. Howard worked from open to close, 7 days a week, and it took a physical toll. The pain in his feet was so bad that he had his remaining toes amputated by Dr. Everett Garland, whose grandson Joe wrote the definitive novel of Blackburn's life, Lone Voyager, from which our story is based. There was only so much cash and cigars, so Howard hoped to turn Blackburn's into a true tavern, with liquor and salty food. But alcohol was a contentious topic. Gloucester voted annually to be wet or dry. Each year was a coin flip. When Gloucester went wet, Blackburn's prospered. When dry, Howard hid booze in back rooms and behind trap doors. This led to the occasional fine. It was worth it. At Christmas time in 1885, Howard, feeling deeply indebted to the people of Gloucester, donated $500 to fishermen's widows and fatherless children, a full repayment of the charity he received. Fishing was the most hazardous occupation in the world, and in the year of Howard's miraculous survival alone, Gloucester lost 17 vessels and 209 men to the sea. After a short courtship, Blackburn, becoming bigger than life by the day, married a quiet dressmaker, Teresa Lally. They lived a few doors down from the business and had a child, Howard Jr. Then tragedy struck again. At only 6 weeks of age, Jr. caught a cold. Howard and Teresa's visiting nurse accidentally overmedicated the baby, who died. Teresa never told her hothead husband the truth, and he held the baby's death against her. A subsequent surgery for Teresa prevented her from ever having another child. By now, Howard's bank account matched his appetite for life. He bought the property around his store, which at that time sat upon Gloucester's inner harbor before the waterfront was industrialized. He hobnobbed with the likes of heavyweight prizefighter John L. Sullivan. He was also incredibly charitable. Howard always carried wads of cash and never said no to a handout. He anonymously had food and coal delivered to households throughout the city. And he stowed away a penny from each sale at the bar for an annual donation to the newly developed Addison Gilbert Hospital. Equally important to Howard was his support of the Lishman family who saved his life. Blackburn constantly paid heavy freight fees to herring boats to alter their course and deliver clothes and food. He redoubled his efforts upon learning that one of the young Lishman children was lost at sea while fishing with Father Frank. After returning to Little River, an inconsolable Frank wandered into the woods and shot himself. When Gloucester voted dry at the end of 1895, Howard rented his tavern to a friend and traveled west, partly for adventure and partly to seek relief from his crippling arthritis. At one point, he ended up on a dude ranch in Hot Springs, Arkansas. During this time, he dreamt of further exploring the country, but he also caught wind about a not-too-distant phenomenon that was gripping the nation again: gold. Men, simple men of modest means, were making unthinkable fortunes in the great Northwest, just as they had in San Francisco a few decades before. Newspaper headlines around the world glorified tale after tale of treasure hunters striking it rich. Howard's eyes grew wide. The enterprising Blackburn figured that with his acumen, fortitude, business sense, and experience, he could lead a successful expedition to the land of riches. When Howard returned to Gloucester, he put a plan in place. It took a month of mild summer weather before dozens of newly rich gold rushers could return from the far reaches of Yukon, the northwesternmost territory in Canada, to the Alaskan port city of St. Michael, where they victoriously boarded a steamship bound for Seattle. It was July of 1897 when a bevy of successful prospectors disembarked the Portland before thousands of onlookers, cautiously lumbering through the crowd, protecting millions of dollars in gold. They used everything they had, coffee pots, blankets, boots, to hold their fortunes against their bodies. It was the biggest strike since 1849. The dream was real. Before newspapers reached the stands, wishful treasure hunters around the world prepared to join the Klondike Gold Rush. Expeditions formed rapidly in New England and around the world. Howard caught the fever too. He lost himself in accounts of expeditions failed and triumphant. He bent the ears of Gloucestermen who followed the gold rush in '49. But that strike was in sunny California, not 3,000 miles beyond the palm trees into the frozen tundra of the Arctic. Blackburn knew only the smartest and strongest could survive. Pushing 40 and looking for a challenge, he went all in. Every inch of the trip had to be reckoned with. The fastest route to the Pacific coast was by railroad, but once there, any hopeful gold seeker would have to join a mining company, then procure years' worth of provisions at prices marked especially for suckers carrying their life savings. Howard's vision was to arrive at the Klondike region of Yukon as the ice broke in the spring of 1898 and get in a full season of prospecting. He'd buy a schooner and stuff her with supplies, including the parts to build a small steamer to navigate the Yukon River. To get there in time, the Blackburn expedition would sail 12,500 miles around Cape Horn to San Francisco. Once in California, Howard would restock the schooner with 3 years of provisions, take on a few paying passengers, and voyage 3,000 miles further to St. Michael. Then, sell the schooner, build mining structures, construct the steamer, and traverse 1,700 miles upriver to the Klondike, if it was passable. Along the way, the crew could row dories through the thawing lower tributaries to pan for gold. Howard was convinced they'd hit pay dirt. Within a week of the Portland's arrival in Seattle, Howard created the Gloucester Mining Company, drafted a contract for a 20-man crew, and shopped for a schooner. He had no problem finding financiers to foot the $3,000 bill. Accepted crewmen were to post $250 to receive an equal share of the profits, just as dory mates did. If someone were injured or died on the excursion, their share would go to their heirs. They'd load the schooner with coal or anything else that might sell in San Francisco to fund the rest of the journey. Everything could be in place by mid-November. "I've been many degrees further north than the goldfields," a confident Howard told the Gloucester Times. "When I was in Greenland, The summers were very mild, although there was snow atop the mountains. The story of Blackburn's plan traveled the country. He interviewed hundreds of applicants. A crew was in place within 2 weeks. Another dozen men planned to travel by land and meet the Blackburn party in California. Howard built a flat-bottom steamer at Vincent's Cove, capable of carrying 35 tons. It measured 50 feet long, 16 feet wide, and less than 6 feet deep. He dubbed it Eclipse. He bought a schooner in Boston, the Hattie I. Phillips, and kept it at Chisholm's Wharf. Built in Essex in 1885, the Hattie Phillips was 96 tons and 110 feet long, longer and larger than the Grace L. Fears. In the meantime, tens of thousands of men and women clogged Northwest port cities and waterways in a mad dash to the Klondike. The U.S. and Canadian governments tried in vain to dissuade people from further overwhelming the region. The Blackburn Party accelerated its pace. Howard signed experienced Captain John Harris, who had crossed Cape Horn twice. Each time a new man was added to the crew, Howard, a savvy publicity hound, informed the local papers, who ate up every detail. The crew consisted of men aged 19 to 52, from a Rockport quarryman to a Gloucester barber. On October 18, 1897, the Blackburn expedition prepared to launch from Gloucester's inner harbor. The wharves were a mob scene teeming with well-wishers. They pushed off late in the afternoon to a wild roar, which got louder as the Hattie Phillips faded beyond the Eastern Point Lighthouse. The first few days were smooth sailing, until they hit a hurricane at the height of the season off the mid-Atlantic seaboard. Howard was enthralled. His green crewmen were not. Some couldn't shake the seasickness. Twice, men were washed overboard and miraculously saved. Blackburn said the unbroken gales and billowing waves were the worst he'd ever encountered. But once they got on the other side of the storm, just north of Bermuda, Howard knew his vessel had the goods to make it. One month after leaving Gloucester, they crossed the equator outside Brazil. Another month passed before they made landfall at the entrance to the Strait of Magellan for much-needed rest and repairs. From there, they navigated to Punta Arenas, Chile, at that time the world's southernmost city, and sold most of their coal at an agreeable price. Some of the crew had an impossible time adjusting to the desolation of Tierra del Fuego, which was also in the midst of an ongoing genocide of its native Selknam people from Europeans. Blackburn, at the crew's behest, sprinkled carpet tacks on the deck each night to deter barefoot natives from sneaking on board. The Gloucestermen continued through one of the Earth's most dangerous passages off the Chilean coast. Reminders of their precarious situation surrounded them. Skeletons of shipwrecks littered the entire landscape. But the Blackburn expedition caught a break. Seas and weather were relatively calm, enabling the men to hunt birds on shore during daylight and sail easily through the night. On New Year's Day in 1898, the Hattie Phillips exited the Strait of Magellan into the Pacific. For all of January, they dealt with brutal equatorial heat. At one point, they dodged a field of waterspouts. Luck was on their side. In late February, they spotted the California coast and were awed by the number of vessels racing to land. When they anchored, men on the dock shouted that the USS Maine was sunk in Havana Harbor, and war with Spain was imminent. Howard's youngest crewman, Fred Head, also learned that his father was lost at George's Bank during the very hurricane they endured upon departing Gloucester. Incredibly, the Hattie Phillips made the voyage in only 4 months. But leaving their lives behind and sailing to San Francisco proved to be the easiest part of the Blackburn expedition. The Yukon River was frozen solid. Arriving prospectors, or sourdoughs as they were called, couldn't get in to stake claims, and those who had reached the goldfields months earlier couldn't get out. Dawson, a tiny First Nations camp, was the center of the rush. In just 2 years, its population mushroomed from 500 to nearly 30,000. Dawson housed hundreds of prospectors clinging to their fortunes, some on the verge of realizing generational wealth, with nowhere to cash in. What's more, the city was ravaged by scurvy and starvation. A young, luckless sourdough named Jack London nearly died there. Paranoid winters guarded their gold for months on end, in bare-bones encampments with scant provisions, hundreds of miles from civilization, and temperatures averaging 30 below. Imagine holding a life-changing fortune in your hands without the ability to buy an apple. Shysters and thieves made everyone suspicious. Many who struck out were paid handsomely to protect stashes or sneak the almost rich out of Dawson by any means necessary. Howard was set aback by the news. To compound matters, he was told that by the time the Blackburn expedition reached St. Michael in late June, there was little chance he could sell the Hattie Phillips at a fair price. Instead, he auctioned the last of the coal and hoped to market the Hattie Phillips in San Francisco, forcing the company to take a steamship to Alaska. The crew was dead set against it. None of the vessels they saw were fit to handle the North Pacific. To keep the men satiated and put a few dollars in their pockets, Howard struck a deal to deliver lumber 750 miles north to Astoria, Oregon. The trip was bumpy, but when the famous fisherman landed, grateful locals did all they could to convince Blackburn to stay and manage the booming salmon trade. They begged Howard to turn Astoria into the Gloucester of the West. Fish were practically jumping on shore, they said. Creating a lucrative fishery was a sure bet. Why risk death and pray for gold? But the men of the Hattie Phillips could not be swayed. They returned to San Francisco to restore the ship and wait for the Yukon River to thaw. Alaska was still a month away. With frayed nerves and endless downtime, the company bickered to the brink of mutiny. For funds, Blackburn again proposed to sell the Hattie Phillips and add additional crew, but no one could agree on the vessel's value or the price for newcomers to buy in. A faction of the men suggested Howard relinquish ownership of the Gloucester Mining Company, claiming to have found someone willing to oversee the operation for a grub stake. Dismayed, Blackburn and a handful of loyalists agreed to leave, only to learn a few days later that the alleged side deal fell through. The Gloucestermen were leaderless. Blackburn refused to rejoin. Instead, he traded the Hattie Phillips for $1,400 in provisions and wished the company well. He still believed they were the best positioned outfit to succeed in the Klondike Gold Rush, if they ever got there. Howard considered continuing to Dawson to open a saloon, but he blew out his knee and dejectedly left San Francisco by train. When he arrived in Gloucester in June of 1898, he literally limped home. The remnants of the Gloucester Mining Company, under new stewardship, eventually took the Hattie Phillips to St. Michael, the first ship of its kind to reach the port that summer. They were greeted by a throng of prospectors who had been roosting on their fortunes for 9 months. As the crew assembled the Eclipse to negotiate the Yukon River, the Hattie Phillips returned to San Francisco with 40 sourdoughs carrying over $800,000 in gold dust, in today's dollars, nearly $29 million. The Gloucestermen got about 1,000 miles from Dawson when they realized they wouldn't make it before the freeze. The Eclipse's propeller broke twice. They anchored and rode dories against racing currents while dodging bobbing ice chunks. Occasionally, they staked claims in the vast, indistinct wilderness. They fell victim to scurvy and frostbite. One man froze to death. The short season passed. As supplies and shelter dwindled, the men reversed course, sledded across the frozen tributaries, and disbanded with hardly any gold dust. It's believed only 7 men of the Gloucester Mining Company ever made it back to the States alive. As quickly as Dawson bloomed, it withered. New gold fields were discovered 800 miles west in Nome, Alaska. Dawson was virtually abandoned. In the end, of the 100,000 treasure hunters who were part of the Klondike Gold Rush, most never reached their destination. Of those who did, hardly a tiny fraction had anything to show for it. Still stinging, Howard was on crutches for 8 months, which gave him much time to ruminate on the failed expedition. He drew 2 conclusions. He must return to the sea, and from now on, he'd rely on himself and only himself. Blackburn believed it was his destiny to sail across the North Atlantic on his own terms with the very hands that were mangled by the sea. Wizened but wiser, arthritic but able, Howard spread out a map of the world and stuck a pushpin in the cathedral city of Gloucester, England, the ancient namesake to the greatest fishing port in the world. Howard Blackburn, the lone voyager, was going to sail over 3,000 miles in a boat barely larger than the dory he wheeled through Burgeo Bank 15 winters before, to settle a score with what nearly killed him, or to die trying. The Blackburn expedition was a failure. Howard was embarrassed that he couldn't control the mutinous Gloucester Mining Company. But without a company to keep, the prideful Blackburn dreamt of the impossible, a death-defying solo excursion across the Atlantic in a tiny boat. It had been done only 5 times before, by men with full use of their hands and feet, unencumbered by crippling arthritis. The first to succeed was Gloucester's own Alfred Centennial Johnson, a schooner fisherman who rowed a 20-foot dory to Liverpool in 1876 to celebrate 100 years of American independence. It took 66 days and nearly killed him. Johnson considered his accomplishment a foolish stunt and rarely spoke of it. In April of 1899, Captain Joshua Slocum, a Nova Scotian who 4 years earlier became the first man to sail around the world single-handedly, spoke at the Chapel Street Baptist Church in East Gloucester about his 38-month odyssey. Blackburn most likely was there, and murmurs within the community began to crescendo that their famous sailor may return to sea. Howard admitted to having a vessel built, but nothing more. It was business as usual at Blackburn Tavern that spring. But before the backshore was in full bloom, Howard announced that he was sailing by himself to Gloucester, England in, about 3 weeks. People were stunned. Blackburn divulged his plans. He'd sail to the Grand Banks from dusk till noon each day, resting in the afternoons. From Grand Banks to the Irish Channel, he'd sail from dawn till dusk and sleep through the nights, weather permitting. He figured the Gloucester to Gloucester trip may take 50 days. Then, sail to ports in France and the Mediterranean before taking a steamer home. The news traveled the world. Blackburn named his 30-foot sloop Great Western, after the legendary British steamer, the largest passenger ship in the world and the first steamer built specifically to cross the Atlantic Ocean. The Acoriana Society, a Portuguese-American club to whom Howard was close, presented a giant American flag adorned with the vessel's name for the journey. Sloop boats were popular amongst independent fishermen. Less attractive, yet less expensive than schooners, sloops held only 3 or 4 bodies, but were made for durability. Crews were able to haul their catches faster and return to the markets while prices were high. The Great Western measured 38 feet from stem to stern, 8.5 feet wide and 4 feet deep. Howard stocked her with 3 months of provisions, from canned vegetables to cured meats. He had plenty of booze, tobacco, and a medicine chest filled with malted milk. The sloop sat at Lane's Wharf, behind Blackburn Tavern. Friends and admirers gathered. Some hardly budged until June 18, 1899, the date of departure. By then, 10,000 people packed the wharves for the best view. It was a gorgeous day with a familiar sea breeze. As church bells rang, Howard, cigar nestled in his thumb, walked from Main Street to the water. The crowd cheered and chanted, giving Blackburn room to wade through and climb aboard alongside a handful of pals. An old shipmate from the Greycell Fears, which sadly sank off the Newfoundland coast 18 months before, let go of the bowline. The Great Western trudged past 5 Pound Island through hundreds of crafts. Roars, gun blasts, and horns echoed throughout Gloucester. Howard waved his captain's cap. It took 2 hours to parade from the dock to Eastern Point. The rooting flotilla returned to shore. The Eastern Point Lighthouse clanged its fog bell and whistle. Howard let the last of his friends disembark at the East Gloucester Yacht Club, positioned the bow to the east, and disappeared off Cape Ann. With Thatcher Island's twin lights far behind him, Howard sailed into the night. Almost immediately, his limbs began to throb and swell. Rheumatism consumed him for 8 straight days. He lost his appetite completely, subsisting on 1 bottle of malted milk. He couldn't fit boots over his stumpy feet. Feverish and unable to cruise, Howard drifted the Great Western off course to avoid passing vessels from noticing and reporting his condition. It got so bad that Howard detoured to Shelburne, Nova Scotia for a doctor, but couldn't reach shore through the fog. Returning to his charted course, Blackburn's symptoms finally subsided. He ate a week's worth of hot food and focused on regaining lost time. For the next month, Howard plodded through rain and pea soup fog toward the Grand Banks. Westerly winds of the North Atlantic were uncommonly quiet. Some days the Great Western barely made 6 miles. When the sun was hidden, Howard relied on dead reckoning. This was the busy path of the New England and maritime Canadian schooner fishing industries. Blackburn crept through the nights on the lookout for ships. Without fingers, he cleverly pulled lines with his teeth and adjusted sails with a twist of his waist. The Great Western was 500 miles east of Newfoundland when the winds began to howl. Howard had to take advantage. He twice worked nonstop for 34-hour stretches, eating only oatmeal with cold water if the seas were too bouncy for cooking. On its fastest day, the sloop gained 122 miles. Blackburn occasionally acknowledged a distant steamship, otherwise he reveled in the solitude. On August 16th, after 2 months at sea, Howard spotted the Scilly Islands, just miles from England's southwest coast. Truth be told, the excursion wasn't that difficult, despite Blackburn's initial sickness and uncooperative weather. In hindsight, Howard wished he took a more southerly trajectory. The warmer climate would have treated his body better. He felt a twinge of dissatisfaction, but all in all, mission accomplished. The next day, he entered the Bristol Channel, which narrows to the Severn River and leads to Gloucester. A pilot boat met Great Western at Portishead and rowed Howard to shore, where he telegraphed the yacht club to say he successfully landed in only 62 days. Delighted Englishmen surrounded the burly, sun-kissed Blackburn, who gave newspapermen a predictably colorful account of his journey, as well as an explanation of his missing fingers. Great Western, flags flying high, was towed through the river canal towards Gloucester. People flocked to the marinas along the route to congratulate the lone voyager. Upon docking, officials paraded Howard through the city in an open carriage. The celebration lasted 5 days. He continued through the south of England, with Great Western in tow. Through the canals, throngs of people rained flowers and cheers. Everyone wanted to pat his back or touch the triumphant sloop. Howard sold the Great Western, stayed in London for 6 weeks, and visited Paris for 6 more. In December, nearly 4 months after crossing the Atlantic single-handedly, Howard took a steamship to New York. A week later, the fingerless navigator, as the press called him, was in Gloucester, ragged from the demands put on his body, but a hero once more. In the age of temperance, saloon keeping required lots of housekeeping. Blackburn spent a fair amount of time in court, fighting fines and lawsuits, or lobbying against forced closures of his highly prosperous tavern. He stayed in the good graces of elected officials and police officers. He maintained a sterling reputation by constantly serving Gloucester's poor families with donations of food and fuel. At the turn of the new century, Howard transformed Blackburn Tavern from wood to brick. Electric lights emblazoned his name above the front door. It was adorned with pictures and mementos depicting his life at sea, and the bar stools were always filled. The remodeled saloon wasn't the only thing under construction. Howard was still bothered by the illness and poor weather that elongated the trip to England. The Great Western, for all its attributes, felt cumbersome and struggled to self-steer when Howard needed sleep. It sapped the joy from the adventure. So he had a shorter, lighter sloop built at Smith Cove. Blackburn downplayed it, but the vessel was clearly designed for a new event. He christened it Great Republic, an homage to the largest wooden sailing ship ever built, a clipper that burned in New York in 1853, a day before its maiden voyage. Howard replaced the wording on his burgee from Western to Republic. Then on New Year's Day, 1901, he publicly challenged any man in the world to race him single-handedly from America to Portugal. If there were no takers, he'd go it alone from Gloucester to Lisbon. Blackburn exuded extreme confidence. He had already traversed the Gulf Stream 11 times before. The route to Lisbon carried 600 miles south of the route to England. The southerly passage would relieve his achy health and, weighing over 250 pounds, help shed a few malted milks too. Ground rules were set. Competitors must stake $100 to $500, which would be donated to Addison Gilbert Hospital. Vessels had to measure 30 feet or less and be manned solo. Newspapers flashed the challenge across the world. It was answered by a handful of hoaxers and publicity hounds. 3 months passed without any serious suitors. Howard withdrew the challenge to focus on making the trip in record time, perhaps as few as 45 days. On June 9, 1901, in a scene nearly identical from when he left for England, Blackburn weaved the Great Republic through a mob of vessels and well-wishers at Gloucester Harbor, aimed eastward, and sailed slowly towards the horizon. Howard anticipated homestretch inspiration by the beautiful Azores, a cluster of volcanic islands 1,000 miles west of mainland Portugal. This excursion enjoyed a much better start. Blackburn kept a journal to document a bevy of passing vessels and marine phenomena at George's Bank. There were eye-widening encounters with swarms of swordfish and lazing sunfish, real threats to a small sloop. He swore at one point that he tried to lasso a baby sea serpent. There was an equally eerie experience when he quietly approached an anchored schooner in the dark of night. This gave Howard flashbacks to his nights hopelessly adrift with Tom Welsh. Then, a stroke of luck. The wind arose and a giant square rigger screamed past the Great Republic. Blackburn was able to ride its wake and the perfect gale for 37 hours. He said it was like stealing a ride on a freight train. Before he knew it, he was 600 miles out of Gloucester. When seas were rough, the spry sloop took its punches. The roiling water top soaked Howard to the bone, but at least it was warm green water. When winds died, a frustrated Howard had his spirits buoyed by encouraging shouts from the famous Confederate steamship Shenandoah. Blackburn stayed at it for weeks, fighting easterly breezes that wanted to push him back to Gloucester. On the 4th of July, he could see Corvo and Flores, the Azores' westernmost islands. Another week passed. There were days with hardly a ripple, then a 62-hour fight through a hellish nor'easter where Howard didn't sleep or eat and navigated by guesswork only. More than once, passing vessels tried convincing Blackburn to abandon ship. He resisted. When the storm left, Howard reached a fleet of fishermen off the shore of Cabo Especial, merely 20 miles from Lisbon. Locals navigated Great Republic through the Tagus River. Blackburn docked in Lisbon just 39 days after leaving Gloucester, beating his prediction by a week. It was the fastest non-stop single-handed passage across the Atlantic ever sailed. Blackburn was whisked to the American consulate and feted by dignitaries. Howard spent 2 weeks in Portugal before loading the Great Republic on a steamship bound for New York. On August 19, 1901, Blackburn stepped off the train at Gloucester Depot to a cheering crowd.